If you don't have money, you don't come in here. Mark Reynolds shouted loudly enough for the entire cafe to hear. Everyone stopped what they were doing. The 50-year-old black man standing at the door, dressed in simple clothes, turned red. Charles Henry Walker had an important meeting there. But first he needed to get inside. Charles took a deep breath before responding. His voice came out calm, controlled. I have a scheduled meeting. Mark Reynolds let out a laugh that echoed through the room. He was 38 years old, hair slicked back with gel, wearing a gray suit that cost the equivalent of 3 monthly minimum wages. His eyes scanned Charles from head to toe. Faded polo shirt, old jeans, worn sneakers, a cracked leather briefcase. A meeting? Mark's voice dripped with sarcasm. Here, in my cafe? He crossed his arms over his chest, completely blocking the entrance. And who exactly is this very important meeting with? He asked, making air quotes with his fingers when he said, important. Charles kept his posture upright. His shoulders did not bend. Robert Caldwell and Augustus Whitman, he said, his voice firm. 10:15 in the morning. Mark's laughter grew even louder. He turned to the nearby customers, looking for support. Are you hearing this? He asked, pointing his thumb at Charles. This guy says he knows Robert and Augustus. Some customers looked away, embarrassed. Others, however, smiled back at Mark. Enjoying the spectacle, a blonde woman in her 40s, a designer purse on her lap, whispered something to her friend, and the two laughed softly. Mark turned back to Charles. His face was red with amusement. His eyes sparkled with cruelty. Let me guess, he said, taking a step closer. You saw them here once, found out they had a meeting today, and decided to show up pretending you know them. His voice grew louder, more theatrical. Probably going to ask for money or try to sell something, right? Charles closed his eyes for a second. 50 years of life. 50 years hearing things like this. When he opened his eyes again, his expression was serene, resigned. May I wait at that table in the corner? He asked, pointing to an empty table. Mark gave a short, dry laugh. No, you may not. His voice was hard as stone. This is a premium cafe for real customers. I am a customer, Charles said. Mark's jaw tightened. Oh yeah? He tilted his head. Then show me how much money you've got there. He pointed at the old briefcase with disdain. Go on, open that thing. Prove you can afford a $20 coffee. A heavy silence fell over the cafe. Dense, suffocating. All eyes were fixed on Charles, some with poorly concealed pity, others with morbid curiosity. An elderly woman with white hair, seated near the window, frowned, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Charles gripped the handle of the briefcase more tightly. His fingers turned white with tension, but his voice remained calm. I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Mark's smile widened. It was the smile of someone who thought he had just won an argument. Then you don't have it, he practically sang the words. That's exactly what I imagined. He took another step toward Charles. Now they were less than 2 feet apart. Mark was a few inches taller. He used it to his advantage, looking down at Charles. You know what the problem is with people like you? His voice was venomous. Charles didn't answer. He just stared back with tired eyes. You see a nice place like this? Mark gestured around the cafe. And you think you can just walk in? You think you have the right? His nostrils flared. But every establishment has its audience, and our audience is not... He paused dramatically, his eyes scanning Charles again. Not people who show up here by bus. The white-haired woman slammed her cup down on the table. The sound made several people jump. This is outrageous, she exclaimed, her voice trembling with indignation. Absolutely outrageous. Mark turned to her. His face took on an expression of fake patience. "Mrs. Beatrice Lawson," he said, his voice sweet and condescending. "With all due respect, you don't understand how the management of an establishment of this level works." Beatrice stood up. She was about 65 years old, white hair perfectly styled, elegant but understated clothing. Her blue eyes flashed with anger. "I understand perfectly how it works," she shot back, pointing her finger at Mark. "And I don't like what I'm seeing at all." Mark shrugged, turning back to Charles. He completely ignored Beatrice. "Look, my friend," he said, placing a mocking emphasis on friend. "I'm going to be very direct with you because I think you're not understanding the situation." He pointed toward the exit with his thumb. "There's a diner on the corner. Good taste, coffee for $1, grilled bread for $2. Much more appropriate for your—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. Profile. Charles felt heat rise up his neck. Not from anger, from shame. A deep, burning shame. One he knew intimately. One he had felt hundreds of times throughout his life. "I have a meeting here," he repeated, each word coming out with effort. Mark shook his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. "No, you don't," he said slowly, exaggerating every syllable. "You made that whole story up." He turned to the other customers again. "Robert Caldwell and Augustus Whitman are VIP clients," he announced proudly. "They've been coming here for 3 years. I know them personally. I know exactly the kind of people they meet." His eyes returned to Charles with contempt. "And it's definitely not people like you." Patricia, the young barista behind the counter, nervously bit her lower lip. She was 23 years old, curly hair tied up in a bun, her uniform impeccable. Her hands trembled as she dried a cup. She knew this was wrong. Very wrong. Yesterday afternoon, she herself had answered the phone. A polite man had called. Calm voice, respectful tone. "I'd like to make a reservation for 3 people. Tomorrow at 10:15 in the morning. Name, Charles Walker." She wrote everything into the system, checked it twice, the reservation was there. But Mark was her boss, and she desperately needed that job. She lived alone, paid for college at night, had overdue bills. Even so, she gathered her courage. "Mark," her voice came out low, hesitant. "There is a reservation. I wrote it down yesterday." Mark spun on his heels. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "Patricia," his voice was a clear warning. "Mind your job." She took a step back, but insisted. "But I wrote it down. It's right here in the system." "I said mind your job!" Mark shouted. His voice echoed through the entire cafe. Patricia swallowed hard. Tears began to well up in her eyes. She blinked quickly, trying to hold them back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, turning back to the counter. Charles observed the entire scene. He saw the way Mark treated his employee, how he humiliated her in public. He saw how her hands trembled as she turned away. He saw the tear that escaped and ran down her cheek. And something inside him hardened. Mark turned back to the customers. His face was red with anger, but he forced a smile. "I apologize for the inconvenience, folks," he said, making a dismissive gesture toward Charles. "Sometimes people show up who don't understand basic social codes." A red-haired woman in her 50s nodded in agreement. "Exactly," she said, loud enough for Charles to hear. "That's why I love this place. It keeps its standards." Charles closed his eyes again. He took 3 deep breaths. When he opened them, he looked directly at Mark. "How long until 10:15?" he asked. Mark glanced at his ostentatiously expensive wristwatch. 12 minutes, he replied with a malicious smile. "Why, going to wait outside until your imaginary friends arrive?" He made air quotes again. "I'll wait," Charles said simply. And then he did something no one expected. He walked over to one of the sofas in the waiting area, sat down with his posture straight, placed the old briefcase on his lap, and stayed there, waiting. Mark blinked, surprised. Usually when he humiliated someone like that, the person left quickly, ashamed, defeated, but that man simply sat and waited. "You've got to be kidding me!" Mark laughed nervously. Charles didn't respond. He just stared ahead, waiting. Mark felt the first knot form in his stomach. Something was different. That man didn't look intimidated. He looked patient, as if he knew something Mark didn't. "Fine," Mark said, forcing confidence back into his voice. "Stay there. When it hits 10:15 and no one shows up, you get up and leave, alone, no scene." Charles merely nodded slightly. The next 12 minutes were the most tense of Mark's life. He tried to return to normal work, greeted customers, checked tables, but his eyes kept drifting back to Charles. The man sitting on the sofa, motionless, like a statue, waiting. Patricia wiped the same counter for the 5th time. Her eyes also kept returning to Charles. She hoped his friends would really show up. Beatrice remained at her table, but didn't touch her coffee anymore. She simply watched, her lips still pressed tight in disapproval. Other customers whispered among themselves. "I think he's bluffing." "Of course he is. Look at the guy's clothes." "But what if it's true?" "Impossible." At 10:14, Mark checked his watch again. 1 minute. He looked at Charles with a victorious smile forming. But then the door opened, and 2 men walked in. Robert Caldwell entered first. 52 years old, perfectly trimmed gray hair, a navy blue suit that probably cost around $5,000. He carried a genuine Italian leather briefcase. On his wrist, a Swiss watch worth more than an average car. Right behind him came Augustus Whitman. 55 years old, charcoal gray suit, designer glasses. His English shoes gleamed under the cafe lights. Mark's face changed instantly. The arrogance vanished, replaced by pure adulation. "Mr. Caldwell?" He practically ran toward them, arms opening wide. "Mr. Whitman, what an absolute pleasure to have you here again." His voice was melted honey, completely different from the tone he had used with Charles. "Your usual table is ready," he continued, gesturing enthusiastically. "I personally prepared it." Robert barely looked at him. His eyes scanned the cafe, searching. "Where's Charles?" he asked, frowning. Mark froze. His smile faltered. "Charles?" he repeated, his voice jumping an octave. "Charles Walker," Augustus said, also looking around. "We scheduled a meeting with him here, 10:15. He glanced at his watch. "Where is he? Hasn't he arrived yet?" That was when Augustus saw him. Charles sitting on the sofa in the waiting area. His eyes widened. "Charles!" he shouted, a huge smile spreading across his face. He crossed the cafe quickly, his steps firm on the marble floor. When he reached Charles, he opened his arms. Charles stood up. Augustus pulled him into a tight, warm embrace, the kind of hug reserved for old friends. "My brother," Augustus said, patting Charles on the back. "It's been too long. I thought you'd disappeared." Robert was already beside them. His smile was just as genuine. "Charles?" He extended his hand, which Charles shook firmly. Then Robert pulled him into a hug as well. "How are you?" he asked, stepping back to look Charles in the eyes. "How's your family?" Charles smiled. It was a small smile, but real. "They're well, thank God," he replied, his voice full of warmth. "And yours?" "Everything's great," Augustus said. Mark was completely frozen. His mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish out of water. His eyes bulged. His face shifted from red to white to green. This couldn't be happening. It simply couldn't. Robert and Augustus couldn't really know that. His mind refused to finish the thought. You know him?" he finally stammered, taking an unsteady step toward the trio. Robert turned toward him. His expression was one of genuine confusion. "Of course we know him," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Charles is our friend. A friend of many years," Augustus added, placing his hand affectionately on Charles's shoulder. Mark felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His legs wobbled. He had to grab a nearby chair to keep from falling. But, he stammered, pointing at Charles with a trembling hand. "But he what, Mark?" Robert's voice turned cold. His eyes narrowed. "What is going on here?" Augustus also sensed the tension in the air. He looked from Mark to Charles. Then he noticed the expression on his friend's face. Charles was calm, very calm. But his eyes carried something heavy, something sad. "Charles?" Augustus asked gently. "Are you okay?" Charles took a deep breath. His shoulders rose and fell slowly. "Mark didn't want to let me in," he said, his voice neutral. "He said I didn't have the right profile to be here." The silence that followed was absolute. Robert slowly turned toward Mark. His expression froze. "He said what?" His voice was low, dangerously low. Mark raised his hands in panic. "No, it wasn't like that. I can explain." "Then explain," Augustus said. His voice was icy now as well. His jaw clenched. I didn't know who he was." Mark gestured frantically. "He came in dressed simply. No warning, no identification. I thought—" "You thought what, exactly?" Robert took a step toward Mark. His posture was threatening. "That he didn't deserve to come in because he wasn't wearing a suit." "No, that's not it!" "Then what is it?" Augustus pressed. Beatrice stood up from her table. Her voice cut through everyone. "I saw everything," she said, pointing at Mark. "This man humiliated Mr. Charles in a vile and cruel way." Other customers began to speak up as well. "He basically threw the guy out. Told him to go to the diner on the corner. He yelled at the employee, too. He was extremely aggressive." Each testimony was another stab at Mark's pride. Robert looked around, seeing confirmation on every face. Then he turned back to Charles. "He tried to throw you out?" His voice shook with contained rage. "He tried," Charles shrugged, "but I decided to wait anyway." "Charles." Augustus shook his head, incredulous. "It's fine," Charles said. "It's not the first time, and it won't be the last." The resignation in his voice broke Robert's heart. He had known Charles for 8 years. He knew his story. He knew where he came from. He knew how hard he had fought. And seeing his friend treated like that, in that place. "Mark," Robert said, turning to the manager with eyes of fire. "Do you know who owns this cafe?" Mark blinked, confused by the sudden change of subject. It's Mr. Walker, Charles Henry Walker." "And have you ever seen this so-called Mr. Walker?" "No, he never shows up. He stays behind the scenes. It was the previous manager who hired me." Robert exchanged a look with Augustus. Then both looked at Charles. "Want to tell him, or should we?" Augustus asked softly. Charles closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was a decision in them. "I'll tell him." He turned to Mark. The manager was pale, sweating, shaking. My full name, Charles said, each word clear and precise, is Charles Henry Walker. He paused. I am the owner of Cafe Essence. The revelation exploded like a bomb. Mark staggered backward. His eyes widened so much they looked ready to pop out. His mouth opened into a perfect O of shock. You... He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He cleared his throat. Tried again. You're the owner? His voice was a strangled whisper. For 5 years now, Charles confirmed, since the day I opened the doors. Robert crossed his arms, watching Mark's reaction with grim satisfaction. Augustus shook his head, stunned by the entire situation. Beatrice covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes shining. Patricia, behind the counter, dropped the cup she was holding. The sound of glass shattering on the floor echoed through the silent cafe. She didn't even move to clean it up. She just stared at Charles, her mouth open. My God, she whispered. The other customers began whispering frantically among themselves. He's the owner? The man the manager threw out is the owner? That can't be true. But the others confirmed it. The red-haired woman who had agreed with Mark earlier was now red with shame. She tried to shrink into her chair. The businessman beside her was on the phone, probably telling someone about the drama unfolding live. Mark gripped the table with both hands. His legs could no longer support him. His face was gray. Beads of sweat ran down his temples. Mr. Walker, he managed to say, his voice breaking. I swear I didn't know. And that's exactly the point, Charles interrupted him. His voice was calm. Too calm. The calm before the storm. If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently. But you shouldn't. Every person who walks through that door deserves the same respect. He pointed towards the entrance. It doesn't matter if they're the CEO of a multinational company or a delivery driver. It doesn't matter if they wear Armani or thrift store clothes. None of that matters. Charles took a step toward Mark. The manager shrank back. I built this place on a simple philosophy, Charles continued. Quality coffee for everyone. Dignified service for everyone. A space where anyone could feel welcome. His voice hardened. But you turned it into an elite club, where only those who pass your visual test of approval are allowed in. I was protecting the establishment's standards, Mark tried. Standards? Charles almost spat the word. What standards? Discrimination? Prejudice? Humiliation? He turned to the cafe. Has anyone else here been mistreated by Mark? The silence stretched for 3 seconds. Then, hesitantly, a young man in a delivery uniform raised his hand. He was in the corner, waiting for a pickup. I have, he said, his voice low. Every time I come to collect an order, he won't let me use the bathroom. Says it's for customers only. Charles nodded, signaling for him to continue. One time I was desperate. I'd had too much water. I begged. He told me to go to the gas station on the corner. The young man lowered his eyes, ashamed. I ended up wetting myself, in the middle of the street. A murmur of shock rippled through the customers. A student also raised her hand timidly. I came here with my boyfriend last week, she said, biting her lip. We had our college backpacks on. He kept following us with his eyes the whole time, like we were going to steal something. She looked at the boyfriend beside her. We felt so uncomfortable that we left without even ordering. An elderly man with white hair spoke up as well. The first time I came here, he looked me up and down, he said, his voice trembling with contained anger. I was wearing hiking clothes. I was coming from the park. He said, and I quote, "Maybe you're lost. There's a cafe down on the avenue that's more affordable." More stories followed. each one revealing a clear pattern of discrimination. Mark grew smaller by the second. Paler. Charles listened to everything with a dark expression. 3 years, he said finally. 3 years you've worked here. How many people did you drive away? How many? Mark didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, defeated. Patricia, Charles called. The young barista jumped. Yes, sir. Her voice trembled. You were the only person who tried to defend me, who questioned Mark. She blushed. I just thought it was wrong. And it was. Very wrong. Charles smiled at her. It was a small smile, but kind. How long have you worked here? 6 months, Mr. Walker. And what's it like working for him? Charles pointed at Mark. Patricia looked at her former boss. Part of her felt pity, but the bigger part remembered every time he had humiliated her. It's hard, she admitted. He yells a lot. He humiliates us when we make mistakes, calls us out in front of everyone. Tears began to roll down her face. Once I spilled coffee by accident. He made me clean it on my knees, in front of all the customers. Said it was so I'd learn to be more careful. Charles closed his eyes, took a deep breath. When he opened them, there was determination in them. He opened the old briefcase he was carrying. From inside, he took out a plastic folder with documents. He walked over to Mark and placed the papers on the table beside him. Do you want to see? He asked, his voice hard. Do you want to see the proof? Mark picked up the documents with uncontrollably trembling hands. Deed to the cafe. Owner's name. Charles Henry Walker. Company registration. Sole owner, Charles Henry Walker. Permits. Licenses. Supplier contracts. All signed by Charles. My God, Mark whispered. It's true. It's all true. The papers slipped from his hands, scattered across the floor. He looked at Charles with desperate eyes. Mr. Walker, please. I need this job. I have a family, bills to pay. You should have thought about that before, Robert said coldly. Augustus nodded in agreement. You don't deserve any consideration. But Charles raised his hand, asking for silence. Wait, he said. Everyone looked at him, surprised. Mark is going to learn a lesson, Charles continued, but not in the way you're thinking. He looked directly at Mark. You are dismissed from the position of manager. That is non-negotiable. Mark closed his eyes, tears finally spilling over. But, Charles continued, I'm going to offer you an alternative. Mark's eyes opened. I have a restaurant on the outskirts of the city, east side, Sabor da Vila. Charles crossed his arms. I'm offering you a job as a waiter, minimum wage plus tips, 6 months on probation. A waiter, Mark repeated, incredulous. Yes, you will serve tables. You will serve workers, people who earn little and work hard. You will learn to treat everyone with respect, regardless of how much money they have in their pockets. Charles leaned forward. At the end of 6 months, if you prove you've truly changed, we'll talk about returning. But never again as a manager, at least not for a very long time. Mark looked at Charles as if he were witnessing a miracle. You're giving me a second chance? I am, because I believe people can change. But this is the last one. If you waste it, there won't be a third. Mark dropped to his knees. Literally. Right there, in the middle of the cafe, he fell to his knees and began to cry. Deep sobs that shook his entire body. Thank you, he managed to say between sobs. Thank you. I will change. I promise. Charles didn't answer. He just watched for a moment. Then he turned to Patricia. You, he said. She swallowed hard. Yes, sir. As of now, you are the temporary manager, with a salary appropriate to the new position. Patricia froze. Me? But I don't have experience. You have something more important, Charles said. You have character. You have courage. You stood up for what was right even when you were afraid. He smiled. That's not something any course can teach. Patricia's tears were now tears of joy. I don't know what to say. Say you accept. I accept, she almost shouted. Yes, I accept. The cafe erupted in applause. Even Robert and Augustus were clapping, smiling. Beatrice was crying with emotion. Justice, she exclaimed. This is real justice. Charles waited for the applause to fade. Then he looked around the cafe. I want everyone here to understand one thing, he said, his voice loud and clear. This cafe was created to be a welcoming space, for all people, without exception. He pointed to a sign on the wall that read, Excellence in Service. Excellence is not throwing out those who don't fit a visual standard you decided on. Excellence is treating everyone well. His voice grew firmer. From today on, any employee who discriminates against a customer will be fired immediately, no matter the reason, no matter the excuse. Charles looked at Patricia. Is that clear? Very clear, Mr. Walker. Good. He turned to Robert and Augustus. Is there still time for our meeting? Robert smiled. Of course there is. The three of them sat at the best table in the cafe. Patricia, still in shock but determined, prepared 3 perfect cappuccinos. While the men talked business, Mark remained on his knees on the floor. Eventually he stood up, wiped his face, gathered his personal belongings, and left the cafe in silence. His journey of transformation was only just beginning. Robert took a sip of his cappuccino. Perfect, as always. But his eyes were fixed on Charles. Why did you never tell us? He asked, carefully placing the cup back on the saucer. Charles looked out the window, watched the cars passing by on the street, people walking quickly, normal life continuing outside. About the cafe? He replied, still looking outside. About everything, Augustus said, leaning his elbows on the table. About who you really are, where you came from, how you got here. Charles turned to face them. His eyes were tired, loaded with old stories. Do you really want to know? We do, Robert said firmly. We're your friends, Charles, but we only know fragments of your story. Charles took a deep breath. His fingers drummed on the table for a moment. Then he began. I was born in Embudas Artes, he said quietly, on the outskirts. My mother, Mary Constance Walker, was a housekeeper. She worked 6 days a week in homes in the southern part of the city. He paused, the memory alive in his eyes. My father, Milton Walker, was a construction worker. He woke up at 4 in the morning, came home at 7 at night, hands always injured, back always aching. Robert and Augustus listened in respectful silence. We lived in a 3-room house, me, my parents, and my younger sister Joanne. Charles smiled sadly. The house had cracks in the walls. In winter we slept under 3 blankets because there was no heater. In summer we suffocated from the heat. Augustus felt a tightness in his chest. His own childhood had been so different. Big house, staff, comfort. But you know what my parents always said? Charles continued. His voice softened, full of affection. They said we were rich in another way. Rich in dignity, in honest work, in love. He discreetly wiped the corner of his eye. My mother worked in 5 different houses, all for wealthy families, and every week she came home telling how she was treated. Charles clenched his fists on the table. There was one employer who wouldn't let her use the same bathroom as the family. Another who searched her bag every day, looking for something she might have stolen. Robert shook his head in disgust. Once, Charles continued, his voice trembling slightly, my mother came home crying, sobbing. She could barely speak. What happened? Augustus asked gently. The employer accused her of stealing an earring, an expensive one. She searched my mother's bag in front of everyone, shouted, humiliated her. Charles closed his eyes. 3 days later, the woman's daughter found the earring in her own bedroom. It had fallen behind the dresser. And did the employer apologize? Charles let out a humorless laugh. She didn't even look my mother in the eye. She kept treating her as if nothing had happened. He opened his eyes again. That was the day I decided. I was 12 years old. I decided that one day I would have money, not to show off, but so my mother would never have to go through that again. Robert swallowed the lump in his throat. I started working at 14, bakery assistant, woke up at 3 in the morning, studied at night. My father didn't want me to, said I should focus on school, but I insisted. Charles looked at his own hands. Large, strong hands, marked by work. At 18, I got a job at the Central Bank of Brazil, cleaning assistant. I cleaned the executives' bathrooms. His voice hardened. Do you know how they treated me? Like I was invisible. They walked past me in the hall as if I didn't exist, left trash on the floor on purpose. Some laughed while I had to clean it. Charles, Augustus began. But I observed, Charles interrupted. Everything. How they spoke, how they dressed, how they did business, how money worked. He leaned forward. At night, I went to the public library. I read everything about management, economics, business, everything I could find. Robert was impressed. By 22, I had saved every cent I could, worked during the day, studied at night, didn't go out, didn't spend money on anything beyond the essentials. Charles picked up his coffee cup, took a long sip, until I saved $30,000, a fortune for me at the time. What did you do? Augustus asked. I opened my first diner, small, 5 tables, me, my sister, and 1 helper. A genuine smile appeared on Charles's face. Sabor da Periferia, that was the name, on the east side, the same neighborhood where I grew up. Is that the restaurant where you're sending Mark? Robert asked. That's the one. I renovated it, modernized it, but kept the spirit. Homemade food, fair prices. Respect for everyone. Charles looked around Cafe Essence. The diner worked. You know why? Why? Because I treated people the way I would have wanted to be treated. The way my mother would have wanted to be treated. He tapped the table lightly. The delivery driver, free coffee. The construction worker who came in covered in dust. Front table, VIP service. The cleaning lady, special discount. Tears shimmered in Robert's eyes. In 5 years, I opened 4 more diners. In 10 years, I had 15. Some simple, others more refined, but all with the same rule. Respect for everyone. And this cafe? Augustus asked, gesturing around. This was a different dream, Charles smiled. I wanted to prove something, maybe to myself. He paused. I wanted to prove I could create something sophisticated, high-end, but without losing values, without discrimination, without prejudice. His voice turned sad. But I failed. Because I trusted the wrong person. And for 3 years, this place became exactly what I hate the most. You didn't fail, Robert said firmly. You trusted. And when you found out, you acted immediately. And besides, Augustus added, the way you handled Mark was impressive. Many people in your place would have just fired him. You gave him a chance to learn, to change. Charles shrugged. Everyone deserves a second chance. My father always said that. But a second chance has to come with a lesson, with consequences, with real learning. He glanced toward where Mark had been earlier. We'll see if he takes advantage of it. The meeting continued for another hour. They discussed business, partnerships, opportunities, but the conversation always returned to values, to the importance of treating people well. When Robert and Augustus finally left, each of them hugged Charles for a long time. "Thank you for trusting us," Robert said, "for sharing your story." "You're more than partners," Charles replied. "You're brothers." After they left, Charles stayed. He sat with Patricia, explained procedures, policies, values. "The most important rule," he said, looking her in the eyes, "is that everyone is welcome. Everyone. Always." Patricia wrote everything down frantically. "And what if someone comes in just to cause trouble? Then you act firmly, but with politeness. The criterion is never appearance or money. It's behavior." He stood up. "I'll be around more often, watching, helping. You're not alone in this." "Thank you, Mr. Walker," Patricia said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I'll do the best I can." "I know you will." Monday morning. Mark woke up at 5 o'clock. He hadn't been able to sleep all night. He tossed and turned in bed, thinking, remembering. His apartment in Pinheiros, which cost $4,000 a month in rent, felt empty now. Too silent. He got up and went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror. The man staring back looked different. Deep, dark circles. Pale face. Red eyes from crying so much. He showered, picked up the uniform he had received the day before. A simple white shirt, black pants, an apron, no Italian suit, no gel in his hair. Nothing that made him look superior to anyone. His girlfriend Julia was still asleep. He didn't want to wake her. Saturday's conversation still hurt. "A waiter?" she had said, her voice too loud. "Mark, you became a waiter?" "It's temporary," he tried to explain. 6 months, it's this or nothing." "But a waiter, Mark, in a restaurant on the outskirts." "Julia, please." "My parents are going to freak out when they find out. My God, what will people think?" He left home at 6, took the subway. Something he hadn't done in years. Sabor da Vila was 3 blocks from the station. A 10-minute walk. When he arrived, at 7 in the morning, the restaurant was already open. Mrs. Rose Gallagher was there. 60 years old, gray hair tied in a low bun, a floral apron. She was short, chubby, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. "You're Mark?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of smoking. "I am." She looked him up and down. "Mr. Walker told me your story." Mark lowered his eyes. "He said you're an arrogant jerk who needs to learn humility." He swallowed hard. "He also said he believes you can change. So I'm going to give you that chance." Mrs. Rose crossed her arms. "But here with me, you're not a manager. You're not a boss. You're nothing but a waiter. Understood?" "Understood." "If I tell you to clean the bathroom, you clean it. If I tell you to wash dishes, you wash them. If I tell you to sweep the sidewalk, you sweep it. Clear?" "Clear." "Good." She tossed him a clipboard. "This is the menu. Memorize it before lunch. At 11, the rush starts." Mark looked at the clipboard. Plate lunch, $15. Takeout box, $12. Juice, $4. Prices so different from Cafe Essence. So simple. "And take that watch off," Mrs. Rose ordered, pointing at the Rolex on his wrist. "Why?" "Because nobody here wears a $5,000 watch. You'll make the customers uncomfortable, and it'll make you feel superior." and you're not. Mark removed the watch slowly, put it in his pocket. He felt naked without it. The hours until lunch passed slowly. Mrs. Rose put him to work helping in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, chopping onions, washing pots. His hands, used to typing on a keyboard and holding wine glasses, were now red from hot water. His fingers burned from the onions. At 11 sharp, the first customers arrived. Construction workers, uniforms stained with cement and paint, heavy boots leaving trails of dirt. Mark felt his stomach turn. Not with disgust, with shame. Shame for how he would have treated those people at Cafe Essence. "Mark," Mrs. Rose called. "Table 3. He grabbed the clipboard with trembling hands, approached the table. 4 men were talking loudly, laughing. "Good afternoon," Mark said, his voice coming out strange. "May I take your order?" One of them, a man around 50, looked at him. "You're new here, right, son?" "I am. First day." "Welcome." The man smiled widely. "Bring 4 PF plates, full, with farofa." "PF?" Mark asked, confused. The men laughed, not a cruel laugh, a genuine friendly one. "Prato fedo, man," another explained. "Rice, beans, steak, salad." "Oh, sure, 4 PF plates, got it." When he returned to the counter, Mrs. Rose was smiling. "You didn't know what PF was, did you?" "No," he admitted. "You'll learn. Around here we speak the people's language." Lunch was chaotic. Mark got orders wrong, dropped a glass, forgot utensils, but the customers were patient. "Easy, son. Everyone messes up at the beginning." "No problem, we'll wait." That kindness hurt more than any criticism. A week passed. Mark woke up at 5, came home at 5 in the afternoon. Exhausted, sore, humiliated. Julia barely spoke to him. She slept, turned away. When he tried to talk, she answered in one-word replies. On the second Saturday, he served a special table. A woman around 45, cleaning uniform, tired face. She came in alone, looking around nervously, sat at the corner table. Mark approached. "Good afternoon. Would you like the menu?" She looked at him with eyes heavy with fatigue. "How much is the cheapest plate lunch?" $15. She opened her purse, started counting coins. Mark watched. 10-cent coins, 50-cent coins, $1 coins. She counted carefully. Her lips moved silently. "I have $13.50, she said softly. "Can it be a half plate?" Mark felt something tighten in his chest. "Of course it can," he said, his voice rough. "Yes, it can." He went to the kitchen. "Mrs. Rose," he called, "the woman at table 5 only has $13.50. Can we make a half plate?" Mrs. Rose looked through the pass, saw the woman. "Make the full plate. Well served. I'll cover the difference." Mark blinked. "You'll pay?" "I will, and you will too. Half each." She looked him in the eyes. "Here, we take care of our own." Mark returned to the table, served the full plate, a generous portion of rice, hot beans, a big steak, fresh salad. "Ma'am," he said, placing the plate in front of her. "It came out exactly right. $13.50. She stared at the plate, her eyes filled with tears. "This is too much. This isn't half a plate." "It is," Mark lied. "We serve well here." She began to eat and cry at the same time. She ate and cried. When she finished, she held Mark's hand. "Thank you, son. Thank you so much. I was so hungry." Mark felt something break inside him. You don't have to thank me." When she left, he went to the bathroom, locked himself in a stall, and cried. He cried because he saw his mother in that woman, Mrs. Helen, who also cleaned houses, who also counted coins, who also went hungry sometimes to feed her children. And he cried because, for 3 years, he had treated people like that as trash. That night, he came home different. Julia was in the living room watching TV. "Julia," he called, "I need to tell you something." She turned off the TV, waiting. Mark sat beside her, took her hand. "I was an idiot, a cruel idiot, and it took me too long to see it." Julia stayed silent. "Today I served a cleaning lady. She had $13.50. She counted coin by coin. She asked for half a plate because she didn't have money for the full one." He wiped away a tear. "And I saw my mother in her, Julia. I saw how many times my mom must have been through that. How many times she was humiliated, treated like less." His voice broke, and I did the same thing. I was that guy who humiliates, who judges, who despises. Julia squeezed his hand. "I know," she said softly. Mark looked at her, surprised. "You know?" "I do. And many times I wanted to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." She sighed. "When you got demoted, I felt angry, ashamed. But do you know when you started to change?" He shook his head. "When you came home on the 3rd day. You were exhausted. But you didn't complain. You didn't curse anyone. You just showered and slept." She smiled. "And in the days after that, you started speaking differently. About the customers, about the work, with respect, with care. And I realized I was liking more who you were becoming." Mark pulled her into a hug. "I love you," he said. "I love you too, but I love this new you even more." In the 3rd month, something changed in Mark for good. He no longer saw himself as a demoted manager. He saw himself as a waiter, and he was proud of it. He learned the names of all the regular customers: Mr. Joseph Ramirez, the construction worker; Maria Lopez, the seamstress; Jonah Brooks, the delivery driver. He knew their orders by heart. "Mr. Joseph," he would call. "The usual?" "That's right, son." He received small tips, coins, sometimes $5, but he kept each one with care. Because he knew what it meant to the person giving it. It was sacrifice, recognition, respect. One day, Jonah, the delivery driver, arrived in a hurry. "Mark, I need to use the bathroom. It's urgent." Mark didn't hesitate. "Of course, go ahead. You know where it is." Jonah ran. Mrs. Rose watched everything. When Mark walked past her, she grabbed his arm. "Do you remember?" "Remember what?" "The delivery driver who wet himself because you wouldn't let him use the bathroom at the cafe." Mark closed his eyes. "I remember." "And now?" "Now I understand. A bathroom has no social class. Hunger doesn't. Dignity doesn't." Mrs. Rose smiled. "You're learning, boy." By the 4th month, Mark was already liked at the restaurant. Customers asked specifically for him. "Where's Mark? I want him to serve us." He felt part of something, a community, a family. And for the first time in years, he felt happy. It was a Thursday in the 4th month when Charles appeared. Mark was serving a table when he saw him. Charles Henry Walker, sitting discreetly in the corner. Simple clothes, cap, sunglasses. But Mark recognized him immediately. His heart raced. Had he come to fire him? To say he wasn't good enough? Mark finished serving the table with trembling hands, took 3 deep breaths, and approached Charles. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice coming out weaker than he intended. Charles removed his glasses, smiled. "Mark, Sit with me for a moment. May I? Of course. Mark pulled up a chair, sat on the edge, tense. Charles watched him silently for a moment. How are you? Good, Mark replied. Tired, but good. Mrs. Rose sends me reports every week. Mark swallowed hard. She does? She does. And do you know what she says? No. Charles leaned forward. She says you're the best employee she's ever had. Punctual, dedicated, respectful to everyone. Mark's eyes filled with tears. Really? Really? She said at the beginning you were lost, but you learned fast. And more important, you learned to listen. To respect. Charles smiled. She told me about the cleaning lady, that you and she covered the difference for the meal. Mark wiped his eyes quickly. I couldn't let her go hungry. Why? Because I saw my mother in her. I saw how many times my mom must have been through that. And I remembered how many people I made go through that. His voice broke. I was a monster, Mr. Walker. A monster who thought he was superior because he had a title. You were, Charles agreed. But you aren't anymore. He placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. Do you know the difference between a good person and a bad person? Mark shook his head. A bad person never admits they were wrong. They keep doing the same things. But a good person, when they see the mistake, they change. And you're changing. You really think so? I'm sure. They talked for a few more minutes. Charles asked about the customers, the challenges, the lessons. It was clear Mark was genuinely different. You still have 2 months left, Charles finally said. Complete the 6 months. I will, and I'll make the most of every day here. Good. Charles stood up, left $50 on the table. Lunch is on me today. For you and Mrs. Rose. You deserve it. When Charles left, Mark remained seated, staring at the money. For the first time in months, he felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could redeem himself. Charles was at Cafe Essence when Mark arrived. It was exactly 6 months after the day that changed everything. Mark looked completely different. Hair without gel, natural, slightly longer. Simple clothes, jeans and a shirt. No suit. His face was thinner, more marked. But there was something new in his eyes. Peace. Mr. Walker, he greeted. Mark, sit here. They sat at the same table as 6 months earlier. Patricia brought 2 coffees without needing to ask. She smiled at Mark. She had heard his story through Mrs. Rose. Mrs. Rose sent me your reports every month, Charles began. Mark nodded, nervous. The last one was especially interesting. Charles opened a folder. She wrote, and I quote, Mark is no longer the man who arrived here. He's better, more human, kinder. He treats everyone like family. The customers love him. I would love to keep him on my team, but I know he has potential for more. Tears rolled down Mark's face. She said that? She did, and more. She said you paid for customers' lunches out of your own pocket at least 5 times, that you stayed after hours helping to clean, that you defended a customer who was being harassed. Charles leaned forward. You changed, Mark, truly. I had to change. I couldn't stand being who I was anymore. And who are you now? Mark thought for a moment. I'm someone who's still learning, but at least trying to be decent, to be fair. Charles smiled. Then you're ready for the next step. He pulled documents out of the folder. I'm opening a new cafe, Guarulhos, a working-class neighborhood, lower middle class. He showed photos of the place. It'll be a middle ground between Sabor de Villa and Cafe Essence. Quality coffee but affordable prices. A welcoming environment for workers. Mark stared at the photos, confused. And I want you as the manager. Mark looked up, shocked. You want me as manager? Yes, but not as the manager you were, as the waiter you became, humble, respectful, inclusive. Charles placed the documents in front of him. Good salary, profit sharing if it succeeds, autonomy to hire and train your team. Mark couldn't believe it. You're giving me a real second chance. I am, because you proved you deserve it. But you need to understand, this is the last one. If you go back to who you were, it's over. No third chance. I won't go back, I promise. This, he tapped his chest, changed. Forever. Charles extended his hand. Welcome back, Mark. They shook hands firmly. When do I start? Next Monday. We have 2 weeks to prepare before the opening. Mark left the cafe floating, went straight home. Julia was there. Julia, he shouted as he walked in. Julia! She came from the kitchen, startled. What is it? I did it. I got it back. He lifted her up and spun her around. I'm going to be manager again, at the new cafe in Guarulhos. Julia laughed, emotional. I knew it. I knew you'd make it. They hugged tightly. But it'll be different, Mark said, stepping back to look her in the eyes. I won't be the arrogant manager I was before. I'll be different. Better. I know, she smiled. And I'll be by your side. Cafe Essence was full on a Thursday night. Patricia managed everything masterfully. She had graduated in business administration the previous semester. Charles had paid for her entire college as a bonus. Now she supervised not only Essence, but 3 other locations. The Guarulhos location, managed by Mark, was an absolute success. Lines out the door every morning, 5-star reviews online. But the success wasn't just the coffee. It was the service. Mark personally trained every employee. Respect above all, he would say. It doesn't matter who walks through the door, CEO or delivery driver, everyone is welcome, everyone is treated with dignity. His story became a legend in the company. The manager who was transformed. New employees heard it during training, as a warning, as inspiration. Charles, at 52 years old, remained simple. He kept visiting stores unannounced, watching, talking, making sure the values remained. One afternoon, he was at Cafe Essence when a young black man walked in. Hesitant, nervous, simple clothes, old backpack. Patricia saw him first. She walked up with a huge smile. First time here? Yeah, the young man said, but I thought it would be too expensive for me. We have options for every budget, Patricia replied. And more important, everyone is welcome here. Always. The young man smiled, relieved. Then give me a coffee, the cheapest one. Of course, sit over there and I'll bring it to you. Charles watched from a distance, smiling. That was success. Not the 23 establishments he now owned. Not the money in the bank, but knowing he was creating spaces where people were treated with dignity, where no one was judged, where respect was the most valuable currency. That night, when he closed the cafe, Charles stayed alone for a few minutes. He looked around, thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation that became transformation, the cruelty that became compassion. Thank you, Mom, he whispered to the air, for teaching me what really matters. And he left, turning off the lights, ready to keep building a more just world, one coffee at a time. If this story touched you, leave a like. Comment. Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Have you ever judged someone? Share this to remind people that respect has no price. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove character is worth more than a title. See you in the next video.